Every principal I know that's struggling is inconsistent with their expectations. We know how to improve schools. It goes down to that consistency and the courage to do it.
That is Dr. Robert Thornell, educator, author, and school leadership consultant. He believes most schools are not failing because leaders do not know what to do, but because they stopped doing what they said mattered.
It was a realization that the work was going to be a little harder than I thought. This was truly a belief system change, a cultural shift that had to happen on the campus. And it had to start with the way teachers believed in our kids.
He explains why instructional improvement breaks down when belief erodes and why no strategy works until leaders confront the mindset adults carry into classrooms.
We rolled up our sleeves and we started calling kids in and talking to them. The second student that came in, he goes, "Why do you care? You're the only person who's ever asked me if I could do better." That really touched me.
Today, Dr. Thornell breaks down how leaders turn expectations into action, rebuild belief across a campus, and create consistency that actually changes outcomes. By the end of this conversation, you'll learn how to turn expectations into action, create consistency across classrooms, and lead cultural shifts that improve instruction without starting over. I'm Dr. Matthew Flippen, and this is Transformational Educators. Today, we're going to focus on this idea of instructional improvement and how intentional leadership decisions shape culture and what aspiring leaders need to do as it relates to instructional excellence.
I love the fact that you use the word intentional, because I think that's the key right there, is that we're doing it on purpose.
Yes, absolutely. Great things rarely happen purely by accident or coincidence. So we can't always control them, but we definitely, when we're intentional about the attempt, then I think it definitely leads to success. We were talking earlier about two of your early campus leadership experiences. And and I'd love to touch on, when you first went to Timberline Elementary and then the Chisholm Trail, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what those two experiences taught you and how you implemented instructional leadership practices that ended up really being successful. So take us back and tell us a little bit about that first principal experience and then that.
That's the best one, right? Well, I will tell you, the very first thing I want to say is being a principal was my favorite job I've ever had. In 30 plus years of education now, I loved the role. I loved it for a lot of different reasons. But when I first took over Timberline Elementary, it was a pre-K through fifth grade campus, Title I campus in Grapevine, Texas, and it was bilingual. That was a whole new world for me. I am not bilingual. I wish I was, so I had to learn quick. But I think in both cases, of both my principalships, I followed veteran principles. And I think there's a lot of good and bad. There were a lot of things established in there. But then there was also probably time to change and poke at some old practices and try some new things. So I learned that. I made a lot of mistakes, but we had a lot of success with those two. I think one phrase I use a lot with new principals nowadays that I wish somebody had told me my first year is the simple one of, don't take down a fence until you know why it was put up. And I've heard that phrase over the years, but I use it a lot. And I think about that there are changes that I wanted to make, and I knew why I wanted to make them, but the community and the culture may not have quite been ready for them yet. And there were things that happened that I didn't realize why they were there. I didn't realize the thinking behind them just as an outside person coming in. And so I think one of the keys that I learned quickly and continue to learn to this day is pause, listen, be visible, and find out what's really going on and why those decisions were made. So that was one of my big learning experiences.
Is there a specific example related to instructional leadership?
One of the funny stories, I don't know if it's totally instructional, it is student achievement, but for instance, the principal that I followed was very big into summer birthdays. And if a boy had a summer birthday, they were a little bit younger than their peers. Maybe that caused some of their discipline, some of their academic achievement was a little bit lower. What that built over time was this particular campus retained a lot of kids, especially in first grade, kindergarten, first grade, then first grade again, and second grade again. Me being a young whippersnapper that knew all the research and everything, retention doesn't work. I immediately fell into a trap of we're not retaining these kids. And you can argue both sides of the research and everything, but I was not prepared for that conversation. The first grade team in particular, I remember talking about, well, we have always done this and blah, 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 blah. And it really works well. And we started talking about it. what I learned to do was ask better questions. Because what we found out was, they did really well in first grade, again, the second year. But if you followed them on out to third, fourth, and fifth, it really did not have the positive impact we had hoped it would have. And so, and I think research bears that out. But it was also, again, one of those things where I kind of, said we're going to do something without really understanding the belief system behind it, because they weren't trying to do anything wrong. They thought they were helping those students. Part of it is I had to reflect on that. Why do I believe what I believe? Right? We can find research to back up anything we want to believe. And so it has to be more than that. It has to, really, are we doing what's best for these kids and these families? And that is one experience that I have used many times in my career of working with principals is, just because you believe something doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's wrong. And so we had to talk what that is. And eventually we all came to a great understanding, and we worked to cut that retention rate down and what we could do, what other interventions, what things could be put in place to help those students. Because we don't just have them in first grade. We have them for 6 years, right? Pre-K through 5. And so that's one example that's always stuck out with me. When you get into real specific types of examples of things like we want kids to have academic discussion in class, and we want to teach this way versus the teacher doing all the talking. Those are definitely culture shifts. And sometimes I felt like, depending on the age of the teacher, the experience level of the teacher, but that's not fair. But we did have to shift how we were teaching as part of the coaches. And I dealt with that, especially I dealt with that at the middle school level for sure.
How long were you at the elementary school?
I was at the elementary 5 years and at the middle school 5 years.
So then you got 5 years of experience under your belt. You get promoted to slightly bigger kids with a different set of challenges. Now, what was Chisholm Trail like when you arrived?
So 2 things. One thing I should have mentioned, both times I was kind of recruited and talked to people I knew, but I was coming new to the district. So when I went to Timberline, I was new to that school district. Nobody knew me. So my credibility was, right here. Same thing when I came to the middle school. Not only was I new to the district, and the superintendent had asked me to come over, which was a nice thing, but I had zero connections in the district, and I was coming from elementary. So you can imagine some of those middle school teachers looking at me like, oh, what is this? Are you crazy?
Well, we do find that it happens that, there's always a reason why you're perceived, potentially not you, but people in general, new leaders. There's always you can't do this. You won't be good at this. There's some negative perception.
There's those things, and you have to build the credibility. I've never taught 8th grade algebra or 8th grade science or whatever it might be. And so how do we go through that? When I took over Chisholm Trail, it was a struggling campus. It was a Title I campus, had a lot of great resources, a lot of great teachers, but there was a belief system that wasn't there, right? It's like, this is okay. These kids, this is the best they can do. And overall apathy of, hey, we're the poor school. We don't have the same type of students that other schools do. This is the best they can do. We were able to fix that fairly quickly, but we fixed it through, I think questions again, can we do better is a question, a story that I always talk about, because I asked that of a student and he said, you're the first person to ever ask me that. And that would really struck me. When I think back to Chisholm Trail, things were going great. I was doing all the things I normally did as a principal, and we were happy, and it was a good start to the school year. And we got to the first report card time, right at the end of the grading period. And I ran the list of student failures. It was about 2/3 of our school was failing at least the class. And I can admit this to you now. I sat in my office and I cried, right? I mean, like, what have I gotten myself into? What is this turnaround? What is it going to look like?
And what is it that brought you to tears?
I think it was a realization that the work was going to be a little harder than I thought, but also the idea that we're going to have to change some things. Like, this was truly a belief system change, a cultural shift that had to happen and had to transform on the campus. And it had to start with the way teachers believed in our kids. We had great teachers. A lot of times we talk about collective efficacy in schools right now. That's a big one. But the term that I like better is collective responsibility, that they were all our kids, And so if a teacher across the hall is struggling, we're not going to shut our door and say our data's good and that's not our problem. We're going to help each other. And this idea of collaborative teachers working together to help each other, I think, was a big piece. There's also a certain level of respect and accountability that comes with that, right? I do feel like sometimes in the name of whatever we consider good, positive culture, we forget about the accountability or the job side of it just to make people happy. And I think that, is it an adult-centered building or is it a student-centered building? And I think what I took over was an adult-centered building. And we had to flip that model. And we're going to do what's best for kids, even if that means the schedule's going to look a little different or whatever it might be. We did some pretty creative things at that time.
You got that first report card back, it brought you to tears. And then tell me, what were some of the first moves you made in response to that?
So, we had about a little over 800 kids at the time, almost 900, and 2/3 are failing a class. And so after I caught my breath a little bit, I said, okay, now I'm gonna run the list for kids that are failing 2 classes, right? Instead of 1, and just see if we can get this to a manageable number. Well, it was still almost half the school. And so I shed a few more tears, right? But, I had 2 assistant principals, 2 counselors, and between the 5 of us, we rolled up our sleeves and we started calling kids in and talking to them. And that's the first thing tell me about this. I have a pretty good story I sometimes tell when I speak, but the second student that came in was the one that just said, you look at this stuff, like, he goes, why do you care? My parents don't look at my report card, and give me this whole spiel. And he ended up becoming one of my special kids, one of the kids that you remember at the end of your career. But we talked throughout the year. But I remember in passing, and I think I just mentioned it earlier, but as he was walking out the door, I just said, hey, do you think you can do better? And he said, yeah, I guess. At the end of the school year, when he did have his grades up and he'd passed the test and everything like that, I remember him telling me, he said, Dr. Thornell, you're the only person who's ever asked me if I could do better. That really touched me. And of course, I can go on with that story. But I think that question became one that resonated with me, because I told the staff that story, and I told them, can we do better? Can we just do a little bit better? That's all we're trying. That's all we're working for. And that kind of became our rallying cry, if you will. Can we do better? A little bit better.
Hey, is today's conversation resonating with you? The educators we feature on this podcast all have one thing in common. They're committed to growth, not just for their students, but for themselves. At Graceland University, we've built programs and partnerships that support that kind of growth. Servant leadership and school transformation for educators who want to make a lasting difference. If you're curious about what that could look like for you, scan the QR code or check out the link in the show notes. Let's get back to the conversation. I know. The importance of expectations that children have for themselves, that adults have for children, that leaders have for staff and themselves, that can't be overstated. We've got to have appropriate expectations.
And I will tell you, every principal I know that's struggling is inconsistent with their expectations.
What's an example? What's inconsistency look like?
Inconsistency meaning, hey, we all said we were going to greet kids at the door between classes before they come into class every day. We all said that in August, and we all loved it and never agreed with it. And now it's October and we're not doing it. Is the leader going to say something? Are we going to do that? Or are we just going to let it go? Right? Because I'm big on, if you allow it to happen, then you're saying it's okay. That's an easy one. But we say relationships matter, and starting at the door. So things like, for us, it was real big. When you go back to instructional leadership, we really zeroed in on writing our thoughts down in journals, right? Every class had journals, whether it was a math class, science class. Well, if some teachers are not doing that, right, then those kids are missing that opportunity. And so those are examples, even now when I walk through classrooms, I'll flip through kids' journals or through their things. It's really one of the things I'll point out to principals or teachers sometimes. Well, you think about this. You remember your days in math when they had all the questions in, the hard ones or the thinking ones are at the end, and those are skipped. Like, why are we not getting to those? And so I had one principal. He said, I took what you said, and we've made a conscious effort, and we start with those, and then the practice is the easy ones, right? And he said, my math scores have gone way up, but it's just those little things that we said we were going to do it. And just the principal, sometimes I say it's courage, but I don't know if it's courage. I think we just get busy, right? We get busy and we don't do the things we know are best. It's kind of like eating, having a good diet. We get in a hurry and it's easier to stop at McDonald's. We know that's not good for us, right? But we do it anyway out of convenience or just because it's easy.
Holding people accountable can also just not be fun. And so when you've set a standard and now you have to go back and say, hey, how are we doing it? You got to be modeling it. You got to be encouraging it.
Can I tell you about it? One of my mistakes then, or not my mistakes, but one time when I kind of lost my cool a little bit. It was my first year at Chisholm Trail. And I won't say I lost my cool, but I have been told sometimes that I have a low look or something like that. But I was working with this teacher, and this was a teacher that was probably giving me a little pushback. And this was probably midway through the year. And I'm embarrassed to say this because it was inappropriate for me to say this, but in front of her whole department, the whole English department, she said, well, I don't even know why you asked us to do this or care about this. Our last principal didn't make us do lesson plans. Again, this had built up in me over time, but I kind of snapped at her and I said, well, maybe that's why he's not here. And I regretted saying that, Matthew. I really did. But the point was made, right? It was okay. It ended up being okay, right? But I regretted in the moment saying it the way I said it. But there was accountability level there. And that's also some of that change going through there. And so, it is what it is, right?
That's a great point. I mean, people hear out loud that there were no lesson plans. I mean, they should be like, wow, that's kind of a minimum expectation. So how do you help teachers see clarity instead of compliance?
That's an important piece. I see some young principals, they're so gung-ho to establish themselves. They create a lot of compliance or a lot of things without really knowing why they're there, what's important. And I think the best leaders peel that away. I do think one of the things I hate to hear people say is, I hire good teachers and get out of their way. I think that is morally irresponsible. Your job is to help teachers get better and support them and care for them. It's not to leave them alone and let them do whatever they want. This idea of the clarity piece, I just think we talk to them, what is important? What do we need to do here? And, what are we trying to learn and how are we going to know if they do it? Those are the old cliche questions of PLC, but they became a cliche for a reason because they're true. Like, what are we trying to teach here and what's the best way to do it? And what I have found is trying to find small wins when teachers can work together to help each other do that, right? I may not be the best person to help you design a biology lesson or a first grade reading lesson, but I can design the schedule to help get you with somebody that can. I can decide, I can still give you feedback. I can still give you the resources to do that. And so I think that's a big piece there. I'm one of those people, I like to be liked, right? I wanted to be liked. I will tell you, that's one difference from elementary and secondary. Elementary, you're kind of a rock star, and in secondary, maybe you got to prove yourself a little bit much. But I think over time I'd rather be respected than liked, even though I prefer both, right? And they're going to respect as an instructional leader. This is why we're doing it. I also think if you take care of people over time, then when you do ask them to do something that they may not agree with or understand, they're more likely to do it because they have the trust in you. They trust that your belief system is there. They trust that you're doing this for the right reason. And so I think it's okay. And I think being vulnerable as a leader too and say, hey, I made a mistake this time, that builds trust as well. It's funny you say that. One of the questions I always ask principals is I ask them, what would your teacher say is important to you? And then I usually when I get a chance, I ask the teachers what's important to them. And I don't care what it is, but the question is it the same answer, right? We all believe this is what's important, that clarity piece. And so that is a coaching question I use.
So you mentioned collaboration. I'm thinking about, you had 2/3 of your children at the middle school that weren't doing well, but you must have incorporated collaboration and mentorship somewhere in there. Tell us what that looked like, how it worked.
Well, I think that a couple of things we do is, and this may sound really easy and stuff, but we have to create time for it to happen, right? Some of it happens naturally. Some of it happens in the hallway or after school and before school. And those are great times and probably some of the most valuable times, but those are also inconsistent times that I can't, it's not happening for everybody, right? And so it was very important to me to create time to do that. And we did it in a lot of different ways, whether it was giving them time through subs, whether it was creating time in the master schedule, but, I can get into all the details. But I do think time is an important piece. Like if I'm going to expect them to collaborate, then I'm going to allow that to happen. I think two big things that we had to pull back the doors on were, one is, how are we designing our lessons? Can we make this lesson better before we teach it? Because once I go in and watch you teach it, it's too late. I can give you feedback on it, but it's already happened. So how can we make the lesson better before we teach it was kind of a mantra that we took on. I have a template that I would share with anybody that wants to. I still share it this day. The first thing it did was, if you were a new teacher to my building, whether you were a brand new teacher or a 20-year veteran, if you were new to my building, within the first month and a half, you and I went on walkthroughs together to master teacher classes. And so this is what it looks like. This is where we're going. Not that you're better than anything, but I wanted all my new teachers to go with me, and we did that. So that was number one, walk classrooms with it. But that also opened the door. Now, the second group that I did, after I finished all the new teachers, well, I would take my department chairs or my master teachers. I wanted them to walk classes with me because I wanted them to see you're an expert, but the people that you're planning with may not be experts. So it helped them in their PLCs and their meeting to see where their team might be struggling or where we're going. So that was one thing that we put in place that I think was very, very valuable there. And that served as a mentor thing. And we got to the point where I didn't have to go on those. Teachers, a couple teachers went on them together, and we created a schedule where 2 teachers would go walk a teacher's classroom. So that was a piece there. But so planning lessons and walking through. And then I think the other part was that we had to realize is calibration of expectations of student work. And so we spent a lot of time. Okay, the assignment was great and the teaching looked great, but then, I had 20 kids in the class and 15 of them met expectations, but 5 didn't, right? Or, Matthew, you graded it this way and I graded it this way. You graded easy, I graded hard. That might help your kids in the short term. It might help my kids in the long term or vice versa. But it was really important to me as the school got bigger and bigger is an A needed to be an A in every classroom.
Right. Now, how did you get calibration set?
We had like a 3-week cycle, if you will, where, one of the PLCs was, they were planning the lessons and everything. The second one, we tried to go watch it. Second week. And the third week, they would bring back some work. All right. And so during their PL time, they were actually looking at student work was a piece that we did there. The other thing that we incorporated, I mentioned earlier that writing was very important. So every class, once a grading period, whether it was band, PE, speech class, home ec, math, science, every class, one of their summative assignments had to be a writing piece. And what that came from was, it was just kind of an accident. It dawned on me one time, we were looking at some student work, and here was this kid, Matthew, and look how he writes and thinks in English class, and look what he turns in social studies class. And it's not the same. This kid's walking down the hall, but the expectations for different classes were different. I'm a big literacy guy, right? We got to learn to read and write and think and communicate and talk. And so we made that an emphasis in all our classes. And so that was part of that calibration piece, is if you can do it in one class, then you need to be doing it in the other class. And what does it look like? And that was very visible in the walls, on bulletin boards, in our PLC room, wherever. I think that was an important piece. It also helped with parents. To be honest with you, that's a whole nother thing. We haven't even talked about that culture shift with parents yet, but I'm sure we may get into that with instruction.
Let's shift over to that a little bit. So, you're trying to deal with instructional excellence and expectations, but there can be parent expectations that are helping or hurting that process. What did that look like at Chisholm Trail?
It looks like a whole lot of things. I think the first thing is, still to this day, but even back then, parents look at the report card, right? They look at the report card and they, okay, my kid has all A's or A's and B's, they're doing fine. And they don't really know what that work is. And so we did that a couple different ways. So I had an old pastor one time, you've probably heard this in your experience, but what's important to you, I can tell what's important to you by looking at your checkbook.
Get your checkbook.
Right? Yeah.
Where do you give?
What do you put into your checkbook? Well, we kind of adjusted that mantra a little bit. So I can tell what's important to you by what you put in your gradebook. And I would talk to teachers about that and say, hey, I get it, right? There's, 10 grades in a grading period. A couple of them may be, hey, I just need to get a couple grades to just do this easy assignment, right? But if all of them are like that, are we really telling the story of what the kid's learning? And so we would do, I call them gradebook audits. Hey, bring me, I know you're doing a lot of cool stuff in your room and that lab was really cool or that discussion was cool. But when you put a grade on something, you're telling the student and the parent that was important and that was a good grade, a worthy assignment. And so we talked about, we need to have worthy assignments, and then that helped the parents a lot. The other thing, when you are visible with what it looks like, we ended up creating on our website, but we had them we'd send them in newsletters and we'd send them everything. This is what an exemplar assignment looks like. And so look at your child and does it look like that? And really talk about, these are the expectations. And when we really practiced with kids that they could write and articulate why their assignment met the standard, that we wanted the kids to be able to articulate that to the parents. We wanted teachers to be able to do that. And that's a lot harder than it sounds, Matthew. But that really helped with our parents. Say, hey, this is where we're going and this is what we're trying to do. And, again, literacy was a big push at the time. And so, hey, what's your kid reading? Get help with all of that. But the visibility of the standard is the standard is an important piece. Like this is what a 7th grade essay looks like. And if yours doesn't look like that, we should be able to articulate why. What is it? And so that's what we did. It takes time. It takes time to calibrate.
How long did it take? To me, what happens is culture and expectations shift. Outcomes shift down later after you've implemented the practices. And so from that first 6 weeks through that first year, did you start to see culture shift and then that really take hold the second, third?
It happened rapidly once it started happening. I think a couple of things stood out, and one of them is going to be something that's probably real hard for some schools to do, but at that time we were able to do it. But we didn't get any extra staff to do this. We talked about it a lot, and the teachers kind of agreed. They took bigger classes. Instead of teaching 7 out of 8 periods, they taught 6 of 8. And one of those periods was a PLC period where they got to meet with their department and work every single day. And again, I mentioned that to some people around the country, and they look at me with big eyes. But that was a step. That wasn't something I mandated. That was, hey, here are some ideas. How could we do this? And that was very much grassroots. The staff bought into it. They believed the collaboration time was worth it. So within that, then they had their conference period every day. And of course, don't touch that, right? But then they had their PLC period. And in their PLC period, I took 2 days of the week and the other 3 were theirs. When I go back to time, an eight period day, 4 periods, I was in their PLCs. And I mean, were there days that I missed? Absolutely. But that was on my calendar because it was important. It was on theirs. And I think that once we did that, boom, things took off. I mean, it really did. Again, the other 2 big ones were the reading and writing push that we did across the curriculum.
It's so incredible. I mean, there's some structural system things that you had to put in place. I want to highlight, you threw out some ideas and they settled on one that actually was going to create more work for them in a sense, but because they picked it and bought into it. And then, of course, getting to see the results of that extra time. Just repeat one more time the statistics. You went from 2/3 failing.
Yeah, to over 90% in all demographics, not just 90% average, all 90%, all different graphics, or 90% in ELA, math, writing, social studies, and science tests, all 5 tests.
And you didn't change out all the students.
Nope.
And you didn't change out all the teachers.
We got bigger. We ended up getting bigger. We went from about 900 that first year. About 5 years later, it was at 1,200 in middle school. And it was good. It was a special place and it was fun. But, I will say that it's not hard. It's a simple formula. And I mean this to the bottom of my heart. We know how to improve schools. We know how. We have enough knowledge. We have enough research. It goes down to that consistency and the courage to do it. And I really believe that the schools that I see that are still struggling, they're not being consistent with their high expectations of academics. They're just not.
Well, it's one of the reasons I'm so excited to get to even do this podcast is because the intent was to capture hundreds of stories of transformational leaders that did versions of what you did. And it's so encouraging to see that I don't have to fire the staff. I don't have to fire the parents. I don't have to fire the children. I can take what's there. I can set expectations. I can adjust, process, build trust, relationships, and then grow from there. And that culture of excellence, consistency, accountability.
Yeah, it just starts happening.
Sounds like magic, but it's not.
I learn stuff from great schools every day. Every week I go in some, I go, I wish I had known that when I was in principal. I'd like to be out being principal and do that. I mean, there's so many great ideas out there and people doing wonderful things that gives me hope all the time.
Absolutely. I love it. I love to hear that. So advice you'd give to emerging principals related to all of this?
I think the very first thing you got to do is be very visible in your school community. That's with teachers, with kids, and parents. Let them get to know you. I think you do it a lot of different ways, multiple ways. I mean, with social media, the way it is now, I do think it's still in some ways an underutilized tool by our school leaders. But you can tell a lot about a school and a leader by what they celebrate, right? If I'm only posting about the football team, do I ever care about band or tennis? Not that I've ever been accused of that, but and so I think I let the community get to know you, but while they're getting to know you, they're also getting to understand what you place importance on and what you believe and your vision for the school. And so I think that is real important for new leaders to do that. I think the second thing is, kind of going back to my idea about don't take down offense and why it's put up is just, be curious, ask a lot of questions about why things will happen. You don't know everything. And so I think you can't be afraid to change things, but you make sure you understand why you're doing it. And not just that you understand why you're doing it, but reflectively, the other folks know why you're doing it too. I think that's important. When you come in and just start changing things that look like they're kind of random, I mean, I think that hurts. Those are things there. And then it's hard work, but just be consistent. It's a great job. I truly believe you don't have a great school without great principals. I've seen great teachers at poor schools, right? You can have a great teacher at a low-performing school, but you won't have a truly great school unless you have a great principal. It's the best job you can have, but it's hard work.
100%. I totally agree. Rob, where can our listeners follow you and learn more about your work?
Well, I am on X at Thornell 5. I usually use X. I've used LinkedIn a lot too, just Dr. Robert Thornell. I do have a weekly newsletter that goes out called Juggling the Job. They can probably find a way to hook on that some, get little ideas and tips to principals. So I'd love for you to follow that and read that along and put my email in whatever you need to as well. I get lots of questions from people as we go.
Fantastic. Well, there's so many great things that stood out about today's episode for me. I took some notes to make sure that I've got some of these in here, but the calibration, the gradebook audits, so many practical examples of how do you shift culture.
We went through this whole thing. I've talked a lot about literacy, but one of the people that probably stands out to me the most that signifies the change in Chisholm Trail was a math teacher / coach. And, we had struggling algebra scores and whatnot. And we did this initiative to write and make our thinking. Let's go ahead. I'll just go ahead and say it. Coach Kleckner is his name. All three of my students went through his algebra class, but he took over. He became the department chair. It was almost like his athletic coaching thing fit in with how we're going to teach now and transform and get kids talking about math. When he came in and 3 years later, and I think still to this day, I think he's got about a 4 or 5 year streak going, but he had 100% of the kids pass the algebra test. When I think of watching teachers change their practice, it's him. It was a great example. And it happened in an 8th grade algebra math class where traditionally our kids were in the 60 to 70% pass range. And over the course of 2 or 3 years, now the expectation is 100%. I get that. So he ended up being one of the campus teacher of the year and all that. But it's just a cool story of just watching somebody take to it and not sure at first and struggle and try it. And hey, here we are, and this is success. And now I got my formula.
What a highlight. I love it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, I'll close out with just, if you found this episode valuable, as I did, please share it with a colleague or an educator benefit. And if you haven't already, please follow Transformational Educators where you don't ever miss an episode. And until next time, keep leading with purpose and transforming schools into places where everyone thrives. If today's conversation gave you fresh insight or inspired you to lead with purpose, please follow the show and tell a friend. It helps us reach more educators who want to make a difference. For more stories, resources, and tools to support your leadership journey, visit graceland.edu. Until next time, keep leading with courage and care.